Public executions were once the ultimate spectacle, gruesome, chilling, and shockingly popular. Nowhere was this more true than at London's infamous Tyburn Gallows. Here, justice and entertainment collided in ways that would be unthinkable today. It was a place where power was displayed through brutal punishment, where executioners became legends, and where the condemned faced horrifying ends before jeering crowds. In this journey through history, we'll uncover the dark secrets of Tyburn's bloody legacy, a place that defined fear, control, and death itself. The rise of Tyburn Gallows, London's death center. Imagine a place where death was a spectacle, where crowds gathered in the thousands to witness human life violently extinguished. That place was Tyburn, a name synonymous with death and infamy in London's history. Located at the crossroads now known as Marble Arch, Tyburn Gallows stood as the ultimate symbol of royal authority and public justice. It first appeared in historical records in 1196. But by the early 16th century it had become the most notorious execution site in England. Known as the Tree of Tyburn due to its peculiar triangular structure, the gallows allowed multiple hangings simultaneously, sometimes as many as 24 souls at once. This architectural choice was no accident. It was designed to maximize fear and reinforce royal power. In an age where justice was public and brutal, Tyburn served as a grim reminder of the consequences of defying the crown. From petty thieves to political traitors, the condemned were paraded through the streets in a cart by the roaring crowds who treated the executions as a form of public entertainment. But Tyburn wasn't just a place of death. It was a stage where moral lessons were performed. It was a place where the state displayed its authority and where society's boundaries of right and wrong were brutally enforced. Yet as the noose tightened around each neck, the question lingered. Was this justice or merely bloodthirsty spectacle? Tyburn's executioner. The faces of death. In the shadow of Tyburn's towering gallows, one figure loomed larger than death itself. Their executioner, feared and despised, yet indispensable. These men were final arbiters of life and death. Executioners at Tyburn were both feared and necessary, wielding the power to grant a quick death or a prolonged, agonizing end. They were paid through tips from the condemned, desperate for a merciful death. This grim transaction was an open secret, recorded in historical accounts as the price of a good death. Despite their importance, executioners were social outcasts, forbidden from regular work and shunned by the public. Yet, on hanging days, they were grim celebrities commanding both fear and fascination. They stood as the embodiment of state power and human mortality, forever etched in the folklore of London's bloody past. The most horrific executions in Tyburn's bloody history witnessed countless grim spectacles, but few were as politically charged as the posthumous execution of Oliver Cromwell. In a brazen display of power, his corpse was exhumed and publicly hanged before being beheaded in 1661. This was no ordinary execution. It was a calculated message from the restored monarchy, demonstrating that even death couldn't shield a traitor from royal vengeance. Cromwell's head was then displayed on a spike above Westminster Hall, a stark reminder to any who dared defy the crown. Yet the horror of Tyburn extended beyond political figures. Women in particular faced Tyburn's merciless justice in ways that underscored societal inequity. One of the most notorious cases was Elizabeth Brownrigg in 1767, convicted of the brutal abuse and murder of her servant, Mary Clifford. Her execution shocked London. Brownrigg's crime was heinous, involving prolonged torture and starvation. The public outrage was so intense that it sparked debates about the mistreatment of apprentices and servants, revealing the darker side of domestic servitude in Georgian England. Her death was not merely punishment, it was a public spectacle meant to restore moral order and serve as a deterrent. Another harrowing example was Catherine Hayes, burned at the stake in 1726 for the murder of her husband, a punishment reserved for women. Convicted of petty treason in a horrifying display, she was chained to a stake surrounded by kindling and set ablaze. Unlike male traitors who were hanged, drawn, and quartered, women faced the pyra method, meant to destroy not just the body, the legacy of the crime. But Tyburn's grim role was not confined to individual punishments. It was also a powerful tool of political repression. After the Jacobite rebellions, scores of Scottish rebels faced severe penalties, here publicly punished as traitors. The most dreaded punishment was being hanged, drawn, and quartered, a fate reserved for high treason. The condemned were subjected to extreme measures that symbolized the crown's unwavering authority. Their remains were strategically displayed as stark warnings against This calculated severity was meant to quash rebellious spirits and serve as a chilling reminder of royal power. The end of Tyburn Gallows, a dark era, closes. After centuries of infamy, the final execution at Tyburn took place on the 3rd of November 1783, marking the end of an era drenched in blood and spectacle. John Austin, convicted of highway robbery, the last to face the noose at this notorious site. His death closed a chapter spanning over 600 years where countless lives were ended under the watchful gaze of cheering crowds. But this closure wasn't just the end of a location, it signaled a turning point in public attitudes toward justice and punishment. Tyburn's closure was driven by increasing public disorder during executions. The once solemn events had turned into rowdy, gatherings with food vendors and drunken crowds treating death as entertainment. Social reformers began to criticize the brutality in the carnival-like atmosphere, arguing that such spectacles hardened the public rather than deterring crime. In response, the government decided to relocate executions to Newgate prison, away from the public eye. This move wasn't merely logistical. It was symbolic, reflecting a shift towards a more civilized form of justice. Yet the impact on society was complex. While Tyburn's closure marked progress, public hangings continued in England until 1868, proving that change was slow and conflicted. Tyburn Gallows was a stage of power and punishment where life ended before the eyes of a captivated crowd. It reflected the brutal justice of its time, a spectacle meant to control through fear, yet its fall marked a shift in humanity's pursuit of justice and mercy. The spectacle of death at Tyburn Gallows wasn't just an execution site, it was the epicenter of public spectacle, a place where the boundaries between justice and entertainment were blurred. Each execution was more than just a punishment, it was a public event. Crowds gathered, some out of morbid curiosity, others for the thrill of witnessing the end of a life. The atmosphere was filled with a carnival-like energy, where the condemned were paraded through the streets as though they were performing for a bloodthirsty audience. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it was common for the condemned to be drawn in a cart from Newgate prison to the gallows, often making a long and public journey to their deaths. The condemned were frequently jeered at by the public, who felt no shame in viewing their deaths as a form of entertainment. This public display was not just about the execution itself, it was about power, humiliation, and control. The crowds cheered as the condemned were forced to confront their fate, and the royal authorities used these spectacles to reinforce their dominance. It wasn't just the criminals who were punished. The entire public was made to watch and understand that defiance against the crown would not be tolerated. The executioner's role at Tyburn. The role of the executioner at Tyburn was a grim but highly significant one. The executioners, who performed these tasks day in and day out, were feared figures who held the power to take life at a moment's notice. But despite their crucial role in the public execution process, were often outcasts, treated as social pariahs. They were typically regarded with suspicion and disdain, even though they were paid handsomely for their work. At Tyburn, executioners weren't just performing executions, they were public figures, serving as living symbols of the crown's power. Their task was to make sure that the execution was carried out swiftly and efficiently, but there was little room for mercy. For the condemned, the executioner was the last person they would see before their death, and whether or not their death was quick or slow often depended on the executioner's skill. Some executioners were infamous for delivering good deaths, meaning they would complete the execution swiftly, causing little suffering. Others, however, were less skilled, and the condemned could face agonizingly slow deaths as a result. Though these figures were essential to the functioning of the public they were forced to live in isolation from society, both revered and reviled. The public nature of executions. Tyburn's notoriety wasn't just built on its role in executions, it was a reflection of how justice was publicly displayed. The gruesome events at Tyburn helped reinforce the monarchy's control over London and the nation as a whole. As public spectacles, these executions were meant to remind the people of the consequences of disobeying royal authority. Public executions were meant to instill fear, but they also served as a form of moral lesson to the people. The brutality of these acts, especially for women, highlighted the inequalities present in society and the way the crown maintained power. Women convicted of crimes such as treason or murder faced not only death but also brutal public punishment, which often involved mutilation. These public spectacles were intended to send a strong message to the public. Justice would be served harshly and swiftly for those who defied royal law, and for those who witnessed the executions, the impact was often long. The public, who saw the condemned suffer before their death, were forced to internalize the message of punishment, fear, and the consequences of crime. The end of the public spectacle. With the rise of social reform and changing views on punishment, the days of Tyburn Gallows began to fade. The last execution at Tyburn occurred in 1783, marking the end of an era of public executions that had persisted for centuries. The public's growing unease with the spectacle of death led to calls for reform. Social reformers and humanitarians began to question whether such public executions were truly serving a moral or judicial purpose. As the criminal justice system evolved, there was a shift towards more private and less gruesome methods of execution. These changes reflected growing concerns over public morality and the human cost of such brutal public displays. Tyburn's closure signaled the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in justice. The move away from public executions reflected the shift toward a more private and civilized form of justice, which aligned with Enlightenment ideals of human rights and the belief in a more humane approach to crime and punishment. The legacy of Tyburn Gallows. Though Tyburn Gallows was closed, its legacy remains a powerful symbol of the brutality of justice in early modern England. The rise and fall of Tyburn reflects the changing attitudes toward capital punishment and public spectacles. Today, Tyburn stands as a symbol of a darker time in London's history, a place where public executions were meant to serve as a reminder of royal power and control. The story of Tyburn Gallows is a tragic reminder of the role that fear and spectacle played in the enforcement of law during this era. Yet, even though public executions are no longer part of the legal system, the haunting image of Tyburn persists as a stark reminder of the brutal methods once employed to maintain control over a population. Tyburn Gallows is a haunting part of London's history, representing a time when death was not only the final punishment, but also a public display of power and control. The once vibrant crowds gearing and cheering as the condemned met their end are now gone, but the memory of their execution remains etched in the pages of history, a dark and unyielding reminder of the price of defying authority.